Colorado Territory, 1882. The sun beat down on the dry plains like God's own judgment, parching the land and the souls who dared to stake their claim upon it. Matthew McCall believed the West was no place for dreamers, only for men with grit enough to survive each day as it came, asking for nothing more. At 25, he had already lived more lifetimes than most men twice his age, and he carried the weight of each one in the set of his shoulders. Fate's just a word folks use when they're too scared to admit life's got no plan, Matthew told his riding partner as they guided a herd of cattle across the rolling plains toward Fort Collins. My pa believed in fate. Said meeting my ma was written in the stars, his jaw tightened, didn't stop them both from dying when the fever swept through Kansas. Matthew was tall and lean with dark hair that curled slightly at the nape of his neck when he went too long between visits to a barber. His eyes were the color of whiskey held up to firelight, and they missed little, constantly scanning the horizon for trouble. Though only in his mid-twenties, he carried himself with the quiet confidence of a man who had faced down death and walked away to tell about it. You're a hard man, McCall, replied his companion, an older cowhand named Ellis who had been riding the range since before Matthew was born. But even hard men need something to come home to besides a bedroll under the stars. Matthew shook his head. I've seen what happens when a man puts his heart in someone else's hands out here. This land takes everything eventually. Better to want nothing so you've got nothing to lose. He believed this with the conviction of Scripture. The frontier demanded a man remain unattached, unburdened by sentiment. Love was a luxury he couldn't afford, not when survival required his full attention. His goal was simple. Save enough money to buy a small spread of his own, work it alone, and die there when his time came. No complications, no heartbreak, no one left behind to mourn. What he couldn't admit, even to himself, was the hollow ache that settled in his chest during the quiet hours of night watch, when the only sounds were the occasional lowing of cattle and the whisper of wind through prairie grass. In those moments, Matthew felt the weight of his solitude like a physical thing pressing down upon him. The cattle drive ended at the stockyards outside Fort Collins, where the men collected their pay and headed into town. Most made straight for the saloon, but Matthew stopped first at the general store to restock his supplies before the long ride to the ranch, where he had steady work as a hand. There's a social at the church tomorrow night, the storekeeper mentioned as he wrapped Matthew's purchases in brown paper. Might do you good to meet some folks who ain't cowboys or cattle. Matthew merely nodded, having no intention of attending. He had been in town less than an hour when he heard commotion in the street, shouting, followed by the frightened whinnying of horses. He stepped outside just in time to see a team of horses pulling a wagon at dangerous speed down the main thoroughfare, the driver slumped over unconscious or worse. Without thinking, Matthew dropped his packages and sprinted into the street. He calculated the trajectory, picked his moment, and launched himself at the side of the racing wagon. His fingers caught the wooden sideboard and he hauled himself up with one powerful movement. Grabbing the reins, he pulled hard, trying to slow the panicked horses while keeping his balance in the wildly bouncing wagon. Whoa. Easy now, he called, his voice steady despite the danger. The horses fought him, but Matthew held firm, gradually bringing them under control until the wagon slowed enough for him to guide it safely to a stop at the edge of town. Only then did he turn to check on the driver and found himself staring into the wide, terrified eyes of a young woman. She wasn't unconscious as he'd thought, but had been thrown down onto the floorboards, clinging to them for dear life. Are you hurt, miss? He asked, helping her to sit upright. I don't believe so, she replied, her voice trembling slightly. The horses spooked when that freight wagon backfired. I couldn't hold them. She looked up at him fully then, and Matthew felt something shift inside him, like ground giving way beneath his boots. She was beautiful in a way that made his mouth go dry, not the painted, practiced beauty of saloon girls, but something fresh and natural. Her eyes were the deep blue of mountain lakes, set in a heart-shaped face framed by golden hair that had come partially loose from its pins during the wild ride. She couldn't have been more than 20 years old, dressed in a practical but flattering blue calico dress that complemented her eyes. Thank you, she said, regaining her composure with remarkable speed. I'm Catherine Grant. My father owns the Double G Ranch north of town. Matthew nodded, suddenly conscious of his trail dust and the 3-day stubble on his face. Matthew McCall, ma'am, just doing what anyone would. I doubt that very much, Mr. McCall, she replied with unexpected directness. Most men would have let us run right out of town rather than risk their necks that way. By now a small crowd had gathered and an older man pushed through, his face tight with concern. Catherine, good Lord, girl, are you all right? I'm fine, father, thanks to Mr. McCall here, she said, gesturing toward Matthew. The horses spooked and he stopped them. George Grant was a substantial man in both body and presence, with the weathered face of someone who had wrestled a living from the Colorado soil for many years. He extended his hand to Matthew. George Grant, I'm in your debt, young man. No debt, sir, Matthew replied, shaking his hand. Just happened to be in the right place. Nonsense, Grant insisted. You saved my daughter and probably a few townspeople besides. We're having a small gathering at our ranch this weekend, nothing fancy, just neighbors and hands. You'll join us, of course. It wasn't really a question, and before Matthew could formulate a polite refusal, Catherine spoke up. Please say you'll come, Mr. McCall, it's the least we can do. Looking into those blue eyes, Matthew found himself nodding agreement against his better judgment. I'll be there then. Thank you. As he walked away, helping a local boy retrieve the packages he dropped, Matthew silently cursed himself. Getting involved with a rancher's family, especially one with a daughter like Catherine Grant, was precisely the kind of complication he'd sworn to avoid. Yet something about her direct gaze and the quiet confidence with which she had recovered from her ordeal had caught him off guard. Just one dinner, he muttered to himself, to be polite. Then back to the job. But even as he made this promise, Matthew felt an unfamiliar sensation in his chest, like anticipation but warmer. He ruthlessly suppressed it. Catherine Grant was exactly the kind of woman who could make a man forget all his hard-learned lessons about survival in the West. Beautiful, capable, and connected to wealth and property, she represented everything that could tie a man down, make him vulnerable. The Double G Ranch stood as one of the most successful operations in the region, a fact Matthew confirmed as he rode through its gates that Saturday evening. Well-maintained fences, healthy cattle, and sturdy outbuildings all spoke of prosperity built through hard work and good judgment. The main house was impressive without being ostentatious, 2 stories of solid construction with a wide porch wrapped around 3 sides. As Matthew dismounted and tied his horse to the hitching post, he fought the urge to turn around and ride away. He had changed into his one good shirt and brushed his hat clean, but he still felt out of place among the carriages and well-dressed guests arriving for the gathering. Mr. McCall, Catherine's voice called from the porch. You came. She descended the steps with a grace that caught Matthew's attention despite himself. Her hair was properly arranged now, golden waves pinned up to reveal the elegant line of her neck. She wore a dress of deep green that made her eyes seem even bluer by contrast. I said I would, he replied simply, removing his hat as she approached. Indeed you did, she agreed with a smile that reached those remarkable eyes. And I'm learning that Matthew McCall is a man of his word. Please come in. Father's been telling everyone about your heroics. They weren't heroics, Miss Grant, he said as he followed her toward the house. Just the instinct. She glanced back at him, her expression thoughtful. Some men's instincts lead them to run from danger, Mr. McCall. Yours led you toward it to help a stranger. I'd say that tells something about your character. Inside, the house was filled with the pleasant hum of conversation and laughter. Matthew recognized some faces from town and a few ranchers he'd encountered during his years of drifting across Colorado. George Grant spotted him immediately and came over with a welcoming handshake. McCall, glad you could make it, he said heartily. Let me introduce you around. For the next hour, Matthew endured more handshakes and backslaps than he'd experienced in the previous year. He answered the same questions about the wagon incident dozens of times, each retelling growing more uncomfortable as the story seemed to grow in the telling. And then he leaped onto the runaway wagon like he was mounting a horse at full gallop, one man declared, though Matthew had done no such thing. I heard the horses were dragging poor Catherine half under the wagon, a woman added with dramatic emphasis. Matthew caught Catherine's eye across the room, and she gave him a sympathetic smile that somehow made it all more bearable. When she finally made her way back to his side, he felt an inexplicable sense of relief. I apologize for all this, she said quietly. Father gets enthusiastic when he believes he's found a worthy person. And has he? Found a worthy person? Matthew asked before he could stop himself. She studied him for a moment. I believe so, though I suspect you'd disagree. Before he could respond, she gestured toward the open doors leading to the porch. Would you like some air? It can get rather overwhelming in here for those not used to Father's gatherings. The night air was cool and sweet with the scent of wild grasses. They stood at the porch railing, looking out over the moonlit ranch lands that stretched toward distant mountains. It's beautiful country, Matthew commented. Your father has built something impressive. Catherine nodded. He came here with nothing but determination after my mother died. I was only 7. He said we needed a fresh start, somewhere with enough space to breathe. She turned to face him. What about you, Mr. McCall? What brought you to Colorado? Matthew hesitated, unaccustomed to speaking of himself. Nothing so purposeful as your father, just drifting, I suppose, learning the cattle business, working where there's work. And what are you looking for? She asked with that directness that seemed so natural to her. Ma'am, everyone's looking for something, Catherine explained. Father was looking for a place to build a new life. I'm curious what Matthew McCall is searching for. The question struck uncomfortably close to that hollow place in his chest. Just trying to survive, Miss Grant. Not much room for searching beyond that in this country. She seemed about to challenge this assertion when a commotion from inside interrupted them. A man's raised voice, then George Grant's attempting to calm the situation. Matthew instinctively stepped between Catherine and the doorway, his body tensing. A moment later, a red-faced man in an expensive but ill-fitting suit stormed onto the porch. "This isn't over, Grant," he shouted back into the house. "You can't keep blocking progress. The railroad's coming whether you like it or not." He turned and noticed Catherine and Matthew for the first time, his eyes narrowing as they lingered on Catherine. "Evening, Miss Grant," he said, his tone shifting to forced politeness. "Lovely as ever." "Mr. Hargrove," she replied coolly, "I believe you were just leaving." The man, Hargrove, looked at Matthew with open hostility. And who might this be? "Another hired gun to help your father frighten honest businessmen." Matthew said nothing, merely meeting the man's gaze steadily until Hargrove looked away. "Good evening, Catherine," he said finally, emphasizing her first name with inappropriate familiarity before descending the porch steps and walking toward a waiting carriage. When he was gone, Matthew turned to Catherine, friend of the family. Her laugh held no humor. "Hardly. Victor Hargrove represents the railroad interests trying to buy up land in the valley. He and others like him have been pressuring ranchers to sell for months now," she sighed. "Father refuses to consider it. This land is everything to him." "And to you?" Matthew asked. She met his eyes. "It's my home. My future." Something in her tone stirred a feeling in Matthew he couldn't name, a mixture of admiration and something dangerously close to envy. To have such certainty, such connection to a place. The rest of the evening passed more pleasantly. Catherine introduced Matthew to some of the ranch hands, solid men who clearly respected the Grants. When it came time to leave, George Grant insisted on walking him to his horse. "You impressed a lot of people tonight, McCall," the older man said, "including me. I've been looking for a new foreman. My current one's getting married next month, moving to Wyoming with his bride." Matthew stopped in surprise. "Sir." "The job's yours if you want it," Grant continued matter-of-factly. "Pays good, includes a cabin of your own on the property. You'd be responsible for the men and day-to-day operations. I'd handle the business end." "Mr. Grant, I'm honored, but we hardly know each other," Matthew said carefully. "I've been a regular hand, not management." Grant waved this away. "I'm a good judge of men, McCall, have to be to survive out here. Besides, Catherine seems to think highly of you, and she's an even better judge than I am." He extended his hand. "Think about it. Offer stands for a week." Matthew rode away from the Double G with his thoughts in turmoil. The position Grant offered was precisely what he'd been working toward: responsibility, decent pay, a place to call his own, even if temporarily. It was a step toward his goal of independence. Yet he couldn't shake the feeling that accepting would be dangerous in ways that had nothing to do with cattle or ranch work. The image of Catherine Grant's blue eyes and direct gaze kept rising in his mind, along with the unsettling warmth they provoked. "Fool," he muttered to himself under the vast canopy of stars. "She's the boss's daughter. And you're a drifter with nothing to your name but a horse and saddle." Nevertheless, 3 days later, Matthew found himself riding back to the Double G to accept the position. He told himself it was the opportunity that drew him, not the woman, and almost believed it. Life as foreman of the Double G quickly settled into a rhythm that suited Matthew's nature. He rose before dawn, worked alongside the men rather than above them, and earned their respect through competence rather than authority. George Grant proved to be a fair employer who valued Matthew's judgment and gave him the freedom to manage the ranch operations as he saw fit. And then there was Catherine. She was no pampered daughter content to remain in the house while men handled the business of the ranch. She kept the books, helped with the horses, and knew every inch of Double G land as intimately as her father did. Matthew found himself seeking her company under the thinnest of pretexts, questions about supplies that could have been directed to her father, discussions of breeding stock that could have waited for morning. They developed a habit of ending the day on the porch, watching the sunset paint the western sky in impossible colors while discussing the day's events. Matthew found himself speaking more in these quiet moments than he had in years of drifting, about his childhood in Kansas, his parents' deaths from fever, his years of learning the cattle business from Texas to Montana. "You've seen so much of the country," Catherine said one evening as they watched the first stars appear. "Don't you ever miss having a home?" Matthew considered this. "Can't miss what you've never really had, I suppose." "Everyone needs somewhere to belong," she insisted. "Somewhere safe." He looked at her then, this woman who had never known the particular loneliness of riding into a new town where no one knew your name or cared if you lived or died. "Safety is an illusion, Catherine. This country takes what it wants when it wants. The moment you believe you're secure is the moment you're most vulnerable." "That's a terribly bleak view," she replied, but there was no judgment in her tone, only curiosity. "Is that why you've never settled anywhere, fear of loss?" The question was too perceptive, cutting too close to truths Matthew had long buried. "It's not fear. It's experience. Everyone I've ever—" He stopped, unwilling to complete the thought. "Ever what?" she prompted gently. "Ever allowed myself to care about," he finally said, the words rough in his throat. "They're gone. All of them." Catherine's hand found his on the porch railing, warm and steady. "I'm sorry, Matthew." They stood in silence as darkness settled fully over the land, her hand resting lightly on his. Matthew knew he should pull away, maintain the distance that had kept him safe for so long. Instead, his fingers slowly intertwined with hers. 2 months into his tenure at the Double G, Matthew was riding the northern boundary when he noticed fresh hoofprints crossing Grant land. Following them, he discovered 3 steers missing from the herd, not an uncommon occurrence in cattle country, but troubling nonetheless. More concerning were the signs of regular traffic along what appeared to be a makeshift trail cutting across the corner of Grant property. He reported his findings to George Grant that evening. Rustlers, most likely, small time, taking just enough to avoid notice. Grant's expression darkened. "Been hearing similar reports from neighboring ranches. Thought we'd been lucky so far." He studied the crude map Matthew had drawn. "This trail, where does it lead?" "North, toward that new mining settlement. Hargrove has interests there, doesn't he?" Grant nodded slowly. "He does indeed." Convenient that cattle seem to be disappearing along a route that crosses the exact parcel of land he's most interested in acquiring. "You think he's behind it?" Matthew asked. "I think Victor Hargrove is a man who believes in creating problems that only he can solve," Grant replied grimly. "Keep this between us for now, Matthew. I don't want to worry Catherine unnecessarily." But Catherine proved impossible to keep in the dark. The next morning, she cornered Matthew in the stables as he was saddling his horse. "You found something yesterday," she stated flatly. "Father was up half the night in his study with the ledgers and maps." Matthew hesitated, caught between his promise to her father and his growing inability to hide anything from those searching blue eyes. "Just some missing cattle," he finally admitted. "Probably nothing serious." She studied his face. "You're not telling me everything." "Your father asked me not to worry you." Catherine's eyes flashed with indignation. "I am not some delicate flower to be protected from the realities of ranch life, Matthew McCall. I have lived here since I was 7 years old. I have nursed dying calves, faced down rustlers, and survived blizzards that would freeze the blood in your veins." Her passion caught him off guard, and he found himself smiling despite the seriousness of the situation. "I never thought you delicate, Catherine." Something in his tone made her pause, her anger fading as quickly as it had risen. "Then don't treat me as if I were," she said more softly. "Tell me what's happening on my ranch." Matthew did, explaining his discoveries and her father's suspicions about Hargrove. To his surprise, Catherine's response was practical rather than alarmed. "We should set a trap," she declared. "If they're using a regular route, we can predict when they'll come again." Matthew raised an eyebrow. "This isn't ladies' work, Catherine." The look she gave him would have withered a lesser man. "This is my home, Matthew, my future. I will defend it as I see fit." There was no arguing with her once her mind was set. A fact Matthew had learned quickly during his time at the Double G together. they devised a plan to catch the rustlers in the act, positioning men at strategic points along the boundary where the cattle had been taken. 3 nights later, their patience was rewarded. Matthew, Catherine, and 2 ranch hands lay in wait near the makeshift trail when the sound of cattle moving slowly through the darkness reached them. Matthew signaled for silence as 4 riders appeared, herding 5 double G steers toward the property line. "Hold steady," he whispered to Catherine, who had insisted on being part of the operation despite his objections. "Let them get fully onto our land before we make our move." She nodded, her face set with determination in the faint moonlight. Matthew felt an unexpected surge of pride at her courage, followed immediately by concern for her safety. He shouldn't have allowed her to come, but denying Catherine Grant anything she truly wanted was proving increasingly beyond his capabilities. When the rustlers were well within double G boundaries, Matthew gave the signal. He and the ranch hands emerged from their hiding places, rifles raised. "That's far enough," Matthew called out. "You're trespassing on Grant land and stealing Grant cattle." The rustlers froze, then one made a sudden movement toward his holster. Matthew's shot cracked through the night air, deliberately wide but close enough to make the man reconsider. "Next one won't miss," Matthew warned. "Hands where we can see them." 3 of the men complied, slowly raising their hands. The 4th, however, spotted Catherine emerging from her position and made a desperate lunge toward her. "Catherine," Matthew shouted, turning his rifle toward the threat, but the distance was too great. Before the rustler could reach her, Catherine drew a small revolver from her skirt pocket and leveled it at the man's chest. "I wouldn't," she said with remarkable steadiness. The rustler halted, clearly surprised to find himself facing armed resistance from a woman. This moment of hesitation was all Matthew needed to close the distance and deliver a powerful blow to the man's jaw, sending him sprawling unconscious on the ground. With all 4 rustlers subdued, the others offering no resistance after witnessing their companion's fate, Matthew finally allowed himself to breathe. He turned to Catherine, expecting to find her shaken by the encounter. Instead, she was efficiently helping the ranch hands secure the prisoners. "Are you all right?" he asked when he could finally speak to her alone as they led the captured rustlers and recovered cattle back toward the ranch. She nodded, her eyes bright with a mixture of exhilaration and determination. "I told you, Matthew, this is my home. I won't allow anyone to threaten it." Looking at her in that moment, fearless and capable under the vast Colorado sky, Matthew felt something fundamental shift within him. The walls he had built around his heart after so much loss began to crumble, and in their place grew a terrifying, exhilarating possibility. That perhaps, against all odds and his own bitter experience, there might be room in this harsh country for something beyond mere survival. The captured rustlers proved more valuable than the recovered cattle. Under questioning by the sheriff, they revealed they had been hired specifically to target double G stock, not for the cattle themselves but to create problems for George Grant. "Hargrove," Grant said grimly when the sheriff departed, "he's trying to force my hand, make me sell." The men didn't name him directly, Matthew cautioned, though he shared Grant's suspicions. "They wouldn't," Catherine added. "Hargrove is too clever to leave such an obvious connection." The incident changed something between Matthew and Catherine. The shared danger, the trust she had shown in him, and the respect he had gained for her courage created a bond that grew stronger with each passing day. Their evening conversations on the porch lengthened, sometimes continuing until the household had long since retired for the night. One such evening, nearly 6 months after Matthew had come to the Double G, Catherine asked a question that caught him completely unprepared. "Do you believe in fate, Matthew?" He looked at her, surprised by the sudden philosophical turn. "Can't say I do, why?" She smiled, her face softened by the golden light spilling from the house windows behind them. "I was thinking about the day we met, if those horses hadn't spooked, if you hadn't been walking out of the store at that exact moment." She let the thought trail off. "Coincidence," Matthew said, but without conviction. "Is it?" she challenged gently. "Out of all the towns in Colorado, all the moments you could have been there, you arrived precisely when I needed someone exactly like you." Matthew shifted uncomfortably. "I'm no hero, Catherine." "I never said you were," she replied with a small laugh. "You're stubborn and too serious by half. You hold people at arm's length like you're afraid they might burn you if they get too close." Her expression softened. "But you're also the most honest, honorable man I've ever known besides my father." The words stirred something dangerous in Matthew's chest. "Catherine." "Let me finish," she interrupted. "I've been watching you these past months, Matthew McCall. You came here believing you needed nothing and no one. I think you're beginning to see that isn't true." She was too perceptive by half, this remarkable woman who had somehow slipped past defenses Matthew had spent years constructing. "What I believe," he said carefully, "is that wanting things you can't have is the quickest path to misery in this life." "And what is it you want that you believe you can't have?" Catherine asked, moving closer to him along the porch railing. The air between them seemed to thicken with unspoken possibilities. Matthew found himself unable to step away as she drew nearer, caught in the gravity of her presence. "Catherine," he said again, her name both warning and plea. She reached up and gently touched his face, her fingers cool against his skin. "Tell me you feel nothing, Matthew, and I'll never speak of this again." He could have lied, should have lied, for both their sakes. Instead, with a groan of surrender, he closed the distance between them and kissed her. It was like coming home to a place he had never been before. Catherine's arms wound around his neck as she responded with a passion that matched his own, and for one perfect moment, all of Matthew's carefully constructed reasons why this could never work seemed to dissolve into insignificance. Reality returned with the sound of a door opening somewhere in the house. They broke apart, both breathing heavily. Catherine's eyes were wide and luminous in the dim light, her lips curved in a smile that made Matthew's heart constrict painfully in his chest. "You were saying," she whispered. Before he could respond, the sound of approaching footsteps forced them to move apart. George Grant appeared in the doorway, his expression troubled. "There you are," he said. "Just got word from town. The bank's calling in loans for several ranchers in the valley, Hargrove's Bank." The news effectively ended any possibility of continuing their interrupted conversation. As Catherine went inside with her father to discuss this new development, Matthew remained on the porch, his thoughts in turmoil. The kiss had changed everything and nothing. His feelings for Catherine, feelings he had been denying even to himself, were now impossible to ignore, but the obstacles remained as insurmountable as ever. He was a man with nothing to his name but his reputation and his skills. She was the daughter of one of the most prosperous ranchers in the territory, a woman who deserved security and stability, precisely what Matthew had never been able to offer anyone. The next morning brought no clarity, only a telegram that drew George Grant into town on urgent business. Matthew threw himself into work, deliberately choosing tasks that kept him away from the main house and, by extension, from Catherine. His confused retreat lasted exactly 3 days before she cornered him in the stables as dusk was falling. "Are you hiding from me, Matthew McCall?" she demanded without preamble. He straightened from checking a horse's hoof, wiping his hands on a rag. "Just busy, Miss Grant." "Miss Grant, is it?" Catherine's eyes flashed. "3 nights ago it was Catherine when you kissed me like a drowning man finding air. Now it's Miss Grant and you can't look me in the eye." "Catherine, please," Matthew said, glancing toward the stable door where any of the hands might appear. "This isn't appropriate." "Appropriate," she repeated incredulously. "Since when do you care about what's appropriate? You're a man who makes his own rules." "Not about this," he insisted. "Not about you, you're George Grant's daughter. I work for your father." Catherine stepped closer, her chin raised in that defiant way that both frustrated and captivated him. "Is that all I am to you, the boss's daughter?" "You know it isn't," Matthew admitted, the words torn from him against his will. "But that doesn't change anything. I have nothing to offer you, Catherine, no land, no future, nothing but uncertainty." "I'm not asking for certainty," she replied, her voice softening. "I'm only asking for honesty." "Do you care for me, Matthew?" The question hung between them, impossible to evade without outright lying. Matthew looked into her eyes and found he couldn't deny what had become the central truth of his existence. "More than I've ever cared for anyone," he confessed quietly. "That's why I can't do this, Catherine. Everyone I've ever—" He stopped, the old pain rising to choke his words. "Everyone you've ever loved has been taken from you," she finished gently, "so you've decided not to love at all." Put so plainly, his life's philosophy suddenly seemed like the cowardice it was. Matthew had no response that wouldn't confirm her assessment. Catherine continued, "What kind of life is that, Matthew? Never allowing yourself to care because you're afraid of loss. That's not living, it's just existing." "It's surviving," he countered, "and survival is all this country allows most of us." "No," she said firmly, "that's where you're wrong. This country demands courage, not just the physical courage to face danger, but the deeper courage to risk your heart despite knowing it might be broken." She moved closer still, close enough that he could smell the faint lavender scent of her hair. "I'm not asking for promises, Matthew. I'm only asking that you don't run from what's growing between us before we've even given it a chance to take root." Looking down at her upturned face, Matthew felt the last of his resistance crumbling. "Your father would never approve," he said, one final objection. Catherine smiled. "My father respects you more than any man he's ever employed. Besides, he wants my happiness above all else." When she put it that way, with such simple conviction, Matthew could find no more reasons to deny what his heart had known for months. Slowly giving her every opportunity to step away, he lowered his head and kissed her again, this time with deliberate tenderness rather than desperate passion. "I don't know what happens next," he admitted when they parted. "This wasn't in any plan I ever made." Catherine laughed, the sound like water in the desert to his parched soul. "Perhaps that's the point, Matthew. Some things can't be planned, they can only be lived." Their newfound understanding was tested almost immediately. George Grant returned from town with grave news. Hargrove's pressure on local ranchers was escalating. The railroad had filed for rights-of-way across several properties, including a critical section of Double G grazing land. "He's trying to cut us off from water access," Grant explained that evening as the three of them pored over maps in his study. "If he succeeds, half our rangeland becomes worthless." Matthew studied the proposed route with growing concern. "This isn't just about the railroad wanting your land," he observed. "This is personal for Hargrove." Grant nodded grimly. "Has been ever since I outbid him on the North Valley section 5 years ago. Man holds a grudge like it's his religion." "What can we do?" Catherine asked, her practical nature asserting itself. "Legally, fight it in court, which costs money and takes time we may not have," her father replied. "The judge in the territorial court is known to be sympathetic to railroad interests." Matthew traced the proposed route with his finger. "If we could prove Hargrove is behind the rustling, we'd have leverage." "We need more than suspicions," Grant sighed. "We need evidence that would stand up in court." "Then we'll find it," Catherine stated with characteristic determination. "Matthew and I will ride to the mining settlement tomorrow. Someone there must know something." Grant looked between them, his expression thoughtful. Matthew realized with a jolt that the older man was far more observant than they had given him credit for. There was knowledge in his eyes as he took in their proximity to each other, the way Catherine's hand rested near Matthew's on the map. "Catherine," Grant said carefully, "perhaps it would be better if Matthew and Ellis handled this matter." "Father," she began in a tone Matthew recognized as the prelude to stubborn insistence. Grant held up a hand. "Not because you're incapable, which we all know is far from the truth, but because Hargrove has a particular interest in you that troubles me." Matthew's head snapped up. "What kind of interest?" "He's asked for her hand," Grant said bluntly. "Twice. I refused him both times, of course. Catherine wants nothing to do with him." "You never mentioned this," Matthew said to Catherine, unable to keep a hint of accusation from his voice. She lifted her chin, "Because it was absurd and not worth mentioning. Victor Hargrove is nearly 20 years my senior and interested only in acquiring Double G lands through marriage, since he can't do it through purchase. Nevertheless," Grant continued, "I'd prefer you stay clear of him while we investigate these matters." The conversation continued late into the night, with plans made and discarded as they sought a solution to Hargrove's machinations. When they finally retired, Matthew walked Catherine to the foot of the stairs that led to the second floor of the ranch house. "You should have told me about Hargrove," he said quietly. Catherine sighed. "It truly didn't seem important." "The man repulses me." "It's important because it means he has more than business interests driving him," Matthew pointed out. "Men like Hargrove are used to getting what they want. Being denied makes them dangerous." "Are you worried about me?" she asked, a smile playing at the corners of her mouth despite the serious conversation. "Always," he admitted. "Though I know full well you're more than capable of handling yourself." Her smile widened. A man who respects a woman's capabilities while still caring for her safety. "You're a rare breed, Matthew McCall." Despite the lingering concern about Hargrove, Matthew found himself smiling back. "Good night, Catherine." She reached up and touched his face gently. "Good night, Matthew. Be careful tomorrow." The mining settlement of Silver Creek had sprung up virtually overnight when a modest vein of silver was discovered in the nearby hills. It consisted of little more than a collection of hastily constructed buildings, dominated by a saloon that served as the community's unofficial center of commerce and information. Matthew and Ellis rode into town shortly after noon the following day, dust-covered and alert. They left their horses at a small livery and made their way to the saloon, where Matthew hoped loose tongues might yield information about Hargrove's operations. "Remember," he told Ellis as they pushed through the batwing doors, "we're just passing through looking for work. Nothing about the Double G or Hargrove unless someone else brings it up." Ellis nodded. At 53, he was the oldest hand at the ranch, and one of the few Matthew trusted implicitly. The saloon was moderately busy despite the early hour, filled with miners taking a break from the grueling work in the hills. Matthew and Ellis ordered whiskey and found a table with a good view of the room, settling in to listen more than talk. Their patience was rewarded after an hour when the name Hargrove drifted to them from a nearby table where three men were engaged in animated conversation. "Said Hargrove wants it done by the end of the month," one man was saying. "Double the usual payment if we can clear all of Grant's cattle from the north section." Matthew tensed but kept his expression neutral as he strained to hear more. "Ain't rustling," another man insisted, "just persuading the stock to relocate. Besides, with the railroad coming through, Grant's living on borrowed time anyway." "Tell that to the law if you get caught," the third man muttered. "Grant's got himself a new foreman who doesn't scare easy. They caught Dawson and his boys red-handed last month." Matthew risked a glance at Ellis, who gave an imperceptible nod. They had what they needed, confirmation that Hargrove was directly involved in the harassment of Double G Ranch. They finished their drinks and were preparing to leave when the saloon doors swung open and Victor Hargrove himself walked in, accompanied by two hard-looking men whose hands rested too casually near their holstered weapons. Matthew turned his face away, but it was too late. One of Hargrove's men nudged his employer and nodded in their direction. "Well, well," Hargrove said loudly, approaching their table. "George Grant's attacked dog out for a walk, long way from home, aren't you, McCall?" Matthew rose slowly, deliberately keeping his hands visible, just passing through Hargrove. "No trouble." "Is that so?" Hargrove's smile didn't reach his eyes. "Funny coincidence, you turning up in my town on my business day." "Last I checked, Silver Creek was open to all," Matthew replied evenly. "We'll be on our way now." He moved to step around Hargrove, but one of the man's companions shifted to block his path. The saloon had gone quiet, the other patrons sensing the tension and moving away from what might become a conflict. "Not so fast," Hargrove said. "Since you're here, we might as well have a friendly chat. I understand you've gotten quite close to Catherine Grant recently." The deliberate emphasis and the knowing smirk that accompanied it sent a surge of anger through Matthew. He fought to keep his expression neutral. "Miss Grant is my employer's daughter. I treat her with the respect she deserves." Hargrove laughed unpleasantly. "Is that what they're calling it these days, respect?" He stepped closer, lowering his voice. "Let me give you some advice, Cowboy. Men like you don't end up with women like Catherine Grant. You're a temporary diversion at best. When she's ready to settle down, she'll look to her own kind." "Her own kind," Matthew repeated, allowing a dangerous edge to enter his voice. "And what kind would that be, Hargrove?" "Men of substance," Hargrove replied. "Men with property, influence, future, not drifters who happen to be handy with cattle." Matthew felt Ellis's warning hand on his arm, a silent reminder of why they were there. With effort, he swallowed the retort that rose to his lips. "Your opinion is noted," he said instead. "Now, if you'll excuse us." Hargrove stepped aside with exaggerated courtesy. "By all means, give my regards to Catherine. Tell her my offer still stands, both offers." The implication was clear. Hargrove still intended to pursue Catherine, whether through courtship or by forcing George Grant's hand through his underhanded business tactics. The thought of this man anywhere near Catherine made Matthew's blood boil, but he maintained his composure as he and Ellis left the saloon. "That man's trouble," Ellis commented as they mounted their horses. "Been around long enough to recognize the type. He doesn't take losing well." "No," Matthew agreed grimly, "he doesn't." They rode hard back to the Double G, arriving as the sun was setting behind the mountains. George Grant listened intently to their report, his expression growing darker as they recounted the conversation overheard in the saloon and the subsequent confrontation with Hargrove. "So we have confirmation," Grant said when they finished. "Now we need to decide what to do with it." "We could take it to the sheriff," Catherine suggested. She had joined them in the study, her face serious as she absorbed the implications of Hargrove's actions. "Overheard conversation isn't evidence," Matthew pointed out reluctantly. We need something more concrete. Grant nodded slowly. There's a territorial judge coming through Fort Collins next week, friend of mine from back east. If we had something solid to show him, he might issue an injunction against the railroad's right-of-way claim. Then we'll get something solid, Catherine declared with characteristic determination. If Hargrove is hiring men to clear our cattle, they'll have to show themselves sooner or later. Matthew exchanged a look with her father. We can set up watches along the north boundary. If they make another attempt, we'll be ready. The plan was set in motion immediately. Matthew organized the ranch hands into rotating watches, with particular attention to the vulnerable north section where Hargrove's men had been focusing their efforts. For 3 days and nights, they maintained vigilance without incident. On the fourth night, Matthew was riding the boundary himself when he spotted movement in the distance, several riders moving cautiously through the darkness toward a section of the Double G where a sizable herd was grazing. He whistled softly, a signal to the other hands positioned nearby, then urged his horse forward at a walk, staying within the shadows of a line of trees that would conceal his approach. As he drew closer, he could make out 5 men methodically herding Double G cattle toward the property line. Matthew waited until the nearest rider was within clear view, then stepped his horse into the open, rifle raised. That's far enough. The rider jerked in surprise, his hand moving toward his holster. Who the hell? Matthew McCall, foreman of the Double G, Matthew replied calmly. You boys are trespassing and stealing cattle. I suggest you raise those hands where I can see them. The other Double G hands emerged from their positions, surrounding the rustlers. For a moment, it seemed the intruders would surrender without resistance. Then one of them gave a sharp whistle, and suddenly more riders appeared from the darkness behind them, at least 10 men, all armed. Seems like you're outnumbered, McCall, the leader of the rustlers called out with renewed confidence. Hargrove figured Grant might try something like this, so he sent some extra hands. Matthew assessed the situation quickly. They were indeed outnumbered, but retreat wasn't an option. If they backed down now, Hargrove would only grow bolder. Last chance to ride away, Matthew warned. Next man who makes a move toward a weapon gets a bullet. For a tense moment, no one moved. Then one of Hargrove's men fired a shot and chaos erupted. Matthew dove from his horse as bullets whizzed past, finding cover behind a fallen log. The Double G hands likewise scattered, returning fire from whatever protection they could find. The gunfight was brief but intense. Matthew managed to wing one of the rustlers, sending him tumbling from his saddle with a cry of pain. Another of Hargrove's men went down when Ellis's shot found its mark. The rest, realizing that their advantage in numbers didn't guarantee an easy victory against determined defenders, began to fall back. As suddenly as it had begun, the shooting stopped. The rustlers retreated, taking their wounded with them, but leaving behind the cattle they had attempted to drive off. Matthew waited several minutes to ensure they were truly gone before signaling the all-clear to his men. "Everyone all right?" he called out. There were affirmative responses from most of the hands, but one voice was missing. Matthew found Joey, one of the younger ranch hands, lying behind a rock, clutching his shoulder where blood seeped between his fingers. "Got me pretty good, boss," Joey said through gritted teeth. "Don't think it hit anything important, though." Matthew checked the wound, a clean through and through that, as Joey had guessed, hadn't struck anything vital. He bandaged it as best he could with a kerchief. "Ellis, get Joey back to the ranch," he ordered. "Doc Peters should be fetched from town." "What about you?" Ellis asked as he helped Joey to his feet. Matthew's expression hardened. "I'm going to follow those men. They'll lead me straight to proof of Hargrove's involvement." "That's too dangerous," Ellis objected. "You can't take on all of them alone." "I'm not planning to take them on," Matthew assured him. "Just to observe where they go, who they report to. If I can get evidence that Hargrove is directly connected to the rustling and the shooting tonight, we'll have what we need for the judge." Ellis clearly didn't like it, but knew better than to argue further. "Be careful, boss. That Catherine of yours would have my hide if anything happened to you." Despite the gravity of the situation, Matthew felt a warmth spread through his chest at the casual way Ellis referred to Catherine as his. It was true in ways he was only beginning to fully acknowledge, even to himself. "Tell her I'll be back by morning," he said, mounting his horse, "and tell Grant what happened here." Following the rustlers proved easier than Matthew had anticipated. In their haste to retreat, they left a clear trail, and the 2 wounded men slowed their progress considerably. Matthew kept a safe distance, using his knowledge of the terrain to parallel their course rather than follow directly behind them. As he suspected, they headed straight for Silver Creek. On the outskirts of the settlement stood a large warehouse with the Hargrove Mining Company name prominently displayed. The men rode directly to this building, where several more figures waited outside. Matthew left his horse concealed behind a stand of trees and crept closer on foot, using the darkness and scattered outbuildings for cover. When he reached the edge of the warehouse yard, he could see Victor Hargrove himself pacing angrily as the leader of the rustlers gave his report. "Grant's men were waiting for us," the man was saying. "Someone must have tipped them off." "Or perhaps they simply aren't as stupid as you are, Jensen," Hargrove snapped. "I pay you good money to handle simple tasks without complications." "McCall was there," Jensen protested. "That foreman of Grant's is too damn good with a rifle. We lost 2 men to injury." Hargrove's expression darkened. "McCall again, that man is becoming a serious problem." "Want us to take care of him?" one of the other men asked with ominous casualness. Matthew tensed, pressing himself deeper into the shadows as he strained to hear Hargrove's response. "Not yet," Hargrove replied after a moment's consideration. "Dead bodies attract too much attention, and the territorial judge arrives next week." "No, we need a different approach." He paced for a moment, then stopped abruptly. "The girl, Catherine Grant, is the key. Her father dotes on her. He'd do anything to protect her." Matthew's blood ran cold at the mention of Catherine's name. "What do you want us to do?" Jensen asked. "Nothing yet," Hargrove said, "but be ready to move when I give the word. If George Grant won't sell willingly, perhaps he'll be more agreeable when his daughter's safety is at stake." It was all Matthew could do to remain hidden rather than confront Hargrove then and there. The threat to Catherine was explicit, and every protective instinct in his body screamed for immediate action. Only the knowledge that he was outnumbered and that direct confrontation would solve nothing kept him in place. He waited until the men dispersed, and Hargrove returned to his office before retreating to where he had left his horse. His mind raced as he rode back toward the Double G. He had the evidence they needed. He had witnessed Hargrove directly involved with the men who had attacked Double G hands and attempted to rustle cattle. But more urgently, he now knew that Catherine was in danger. Dawn was breaking as Matthew rode into the ranch yard. George Grant was waiting on the porch, his face grave. The moment Matthew dismounted, Grant approached him. "Joey's going to be fine," he said without preamble. "Doc Peters removed the bullet and says he should recover fully with rest." Matthew nodded, relieved. "Good, where's Catherine?" "Inside, finally sleeping. She was up all night waiting for word." Grant studied Matthew's face. "You found something?" It wasn't a question, but Matthew nodded again. "Hargrove was there, receiving the rustler's report directly. I heard him give orders." He hesitated, then added, "He also made threats against Catherine." Grant's expression hardened. "What kind of threats?" Matthew related everything he had overheard, including Hargrove's ominous suggestion that Catherine's safety might be used as leverage against her father. As he spoke, he saw the older man's face grow increasingly pale with anger. "I want her out of here," Grant said when Matthew finished. "At least until this business with Hargrove is settled. My sister in Denver would take her in." "Catherine won't go willingly," Matthew pointed out. "You know that." Grant sighed heavily. "I do, but I can't risk her safety, Matthew. She's all I have in this world." The depth of feeling in the older man's voice resonated with Matthew's own growing sense of what Catherine meant to him. "I'll protect her with my life, sir." Grant looked at him sharply, then his expression softened. "I believe you would." He was silent for a moment before continuing. "How long has it been going on between you two?" Matthew didn't pretend to misunderstand. "Not long, and it's not what you might think, sir. I respect Catherine more than anyone I've ever known." "I know you do," Grant replied. "I've seen the way you look at her and the way she looks at you." He smiled faintly. "Did you think I wouldn't notice?" "I had hoped to speak with you properly," Matthew admitted, "when the time was right." "And when would that be?" Grant asked, though his tone held no accusation. "When you felt worthy enough. When you had property of your own. Some men spend their whole lives waiting for the perfect moment, only to discover it passed them by years ago." The wisdom in these words struck Matthew deeply. Wasn't that precisely what he had been doing, holding Catherine at arm's length because he didn't feel he had enough to offer her? "I love your daughter, sir," Matthew said simply. "I can't offer her wealth or position, but I can promise to dedicate every day to her happiness and security." Grant clapped him on the shoulder. That's all any father could ask for his daughter. His expression grew serious again. But first we need to deal with Hargrove. I want you to ride to Fort Collins today and speak with Sheriff Taylor. Tell him everything you witnessed last night. Matthew nodded. And Catherine? I'll tell her what's happened and why we're concerned, Grant promised, though I expect she'll have plenty to say about any plan that involves sending her away for her own protection. Grant's prediction proved accurate. By the time Matthew returned from his errand to Fort Collins, where Sheriff Taylor had taken his statement and promised to investigate Hargrove's activities, Catherine was in a state of righteous indignation. I will not be sent away like a child while men decide my fate, she declared the moment Matthew entered the house. This is my home too, and I have every right to defend it. Matthew couldn't help but admire her spirit even as he worried for her safety. No one's questioning your right or ability to defend your home, Catherine, but Hargrove has specifically targeted you. That changes things. It changes nothing, she insisted. I refuse to let that man's threats dictate my actions. George Grant, who had been watching this exchange with a mixture of concern and resignation, cleared his throat. The sheriff is sending deputies to bring Hargrove in for questioning based on Matthew's testimony. In the meantime, no one goes anywhere alone, especially you, Catherine. She looked as if she might argue further, but something in her father's expression made her relent. Fine, but I'm not leaving the ranch. Grant exchanged a look with Matthew that clearly communicated they would revisit this discussion later. For now, they had more immediate concerns. Sheriff Taylor had warned that legal proceedings against Hargrove might take time, during which the railroad's claim on Double G land would continue to advance through the territorial courts. We need to present our case directly to Judge Hollister when he arrives next week, Grant said. Matthew's testimony, combined with the evidence of the attack on our men, should be enough to at least delay the railroad's claim until a full investigation can be completed. The next few days passed in a state of tense watchfulness. Matthew doubled the guards on the property and insisted that Catherine remain within sight of the main house at all times, much to her frustration. No further incidents occurred, but the sense of waiting for Hargrove's next move hung over the ranch like a storm cloud. 3 days after the gunfight, Sheriff Taylor rode out to the Double G with news. Hargrove had disappeared from Silver Creek the day after Matthew's visit to the sheriff, leaving behind a message that he was traveling to Denver on urgent business. His absence delayed the investigation as the sheriff couldn't question him directly about the allegations. Judge Hollister arrives tomorrow, Taylor informed them. I've briefed him on the situation and he's agreed to hear your case first thing. This news brought cautious optimism. If the judge ruled in their favor, even temporarily, it would give them time to build a stronger case against Hargrove and potentially stop his harassment of the Double G permanently. The following morning, Matthew rode into Fort Collins with George Grant to meet with Judge Hollister. Catherine had insisted on accompanying them, arguing that as a co-owner of the ranch, her father having given her a share on her 21st birthday, she had every right to be present for proceedings that affected her property. Neither man had found a compelling counterargument. The territorial court convened in a modest building near the center of town. Judge Edward Hollister, a distinguished-looking man in his 60s with a reputation for fairness, listened attentively as Matthew recounted what he had witnessed at Hargrove's warehouse. "And you're certain it was Victor Hargrove himself giving these orders?" the judge asked. "Yes, Your Honor," Matthew replied. "I saw and heard him clearly." Hollister turned to Sheriff Taylor. "And what of Mr. Hargrove? Has he returned to answer these charges?" "No, Your Honor," Taylor responded. "My deputies are still looking for him. His employees claim he's in Denver, but no one seems to know exactly where." The judge considered this information, then addressed George Grant. "Mr. Grant, these are serious allegations against a prominent businessman. While Mr. McCall's testimony is compelling, without Mr. Hargrove present to defend himself, I must proceed cautiously." "We understand, Your Honor," Grant said. "We're simply asking for a delay in the railroad's right-of-way claim until this matter can be fully investigated. If Hargrove is using illegal means to pressure landowners, surely that casts doubt on the legitimacy of the railroad's application." Judge Hollister nodded slowly. "A reasonable request. I am inclined to grant a 30-day stay on the railroad's claim pending further investigation." He turned to the court clerk. "Prepare the necessary documents. I'll sign them this afternoon." It was a small victory, but a significant one. As they left the courthouse, Catherine's relief was evident in her smile. 30 days should be enough time for Sheriff Taylor to find Hargrove and get to the bottom of this, she said. Let's hope so, Matthew replied, though he couldn't shake the feeling that Hargrove's disappearance was too convenient to be coincidental. Their cautious optimism was short-lived. As they mounted their horses to return to the ranch, a young boy ran up to them out of breath. "Mr. McCall, Mr. Grant," he gasped. "There's trouble at your ranch. Ellis sent me to find you." Matthew's heart lurched. "What kind of trouble?" "Fire," the boy exclaimed. "The north pasture's burning, and some men were seen riding away from it." They didn't wait to hear more. Matthew, Catherine, and Grant spurred their horses toward the Double G, the 30-mile ride seeming interminable as a column of black smoke became visible in the distance. When they crested the final hill overlooking the ranch, the sight that greeted them was worse than Matthew had feared. The north pasture was indeed ablaze, the fire spreading rapidly across the dry grassland toward the main ranch buildings. The ranch hands were fighting desperately to contain it, digging fire breaks and beating back the flames with wet blankets. As they galloped down the hill, Ellis broke away from the firefighting efforts to meet them. His face was blackened with soot, his expression grim. "Started about an hour after you left," he reported between coughs. "Saw 5 riders setting it, but we couldn't catch them. They knew what they were doing, set it in multiple places with the wind behind it." "Hargrove," Grant said flatly, dismounting, "has to be." There was no time for further discussion. For the next several hours, every person on the Double G fought the fire with desperate determination. Catherine worked alongside the men, filling buckets from the well and helping to dig fire breaks, her face streaked with soot and sweat. As dusk fell, they finally gained the upper hand. The fire had consumed nearly a third of the north pasture, prime grazing land that would take seasons to recover, but they had managed to save the buildings and the remaining rangeland. Exhausted, they gathered near the charred boundary where they had finally stopped the fire's advance. George Grant surveyed the damage, his expression bleak. "He's not going to stop," he said quietly. "Not until he gets what he wants." "We don't know for certain it was Hargrove," Catherine pointed out, though her tone suggested she believed otherwise. "Don't we?" Grant replied wearily. "This is too deliberate, too targeted." First the rustling, now this, always focused on the north section, the exact land the railroad wants. Matthew nodded grimly. The judge's ruling threatened his plans. This is his response, showing us what he's capable of. Grant turned to Catherine, his expression resolute. "You're going to Denver tomorrow to stay with your aunt. That's not a request, Catherine. I won't risk your safety any longer." To Matthew's surprise, Catherine didn't immediately object. The reality of the day's events, the deliberate destruction, the escalating threat seemed to have sobered her. "All right," she agreed quietly, "but only for a week. If nothing else happens in that time, I'm coming home." Grant looked as if he might argue but nodded instead. "A week, Matthew will escort you." "No," Catherine said quickly. "You need Matthew here to help rebuild and keep watch. I can travel with the stage, it's perfectly safe." Matthew started to protest, but Grant raised a hand. "She's right. I can't spare you right now, not with half our pasture destroyed and the herd needing to be moved. Sheriff Taylor can arrange for a deputy to accompany her to Denver." Though every instinct urged him to stay with Catherine, Matthew knew the practical reality of the situation demanded his presence at the Double G. The ranch needed every hand to recover from the fire and prepare for whatever Hargrove might do next. The following morning, Matthew stood with George Grant at the stagecoach stop in Fort Collins, watching as Catherine boarded the coach that would carry her to Denver. A deputy sheriff sat atop the coach, shotgun across his lap, protection arranged by Sheriff Taylor as promised. "I'll write as soon as I arrive," Catherine told them, leaning down from the coach window. Her eyes met Matthew's, conveying everything they couldn't say openly. "Be careful, both of you, don't do anything reckless." "We'll be fine," Grant assured her. "It's just for a week." As the stage pulled away, Matthew felt a strange hollowness in his chest, as if something vital had been removed. In just a few short months, Catherine Grant had become as necessary to him as breathing, her absence now a physical ache. "She'll be safe in Denver," Grant said, as much to reassure himself as Matthew, "and we have work to do." The work proved abundant. Beyond repairing the fire damage, they needed to relocate the herd to undamaged pasture and maintain vigilance against further attacks. Matthew threw himself into these tasks with single-minded determination, working from dawn until well after dusk each day. 3 days after Catherine's departure, a letter arrived from Denver confirming her safe arrival at her aunt's home. The knowledge that she was safely away from Hargrove's reach allowed Matthew to breathe a little easier, though he still found himself looking for her automatically whenever he returned to the main house. On the fourth day, Sheriff Taylor rode out to the Double G with news. Hargrove's back in Silver Creek, he informed them, claiming he knows nothing about the fire or the rustling. Says he was in Denver meeting with railroad officials the whole time. Can he prove it? Grant asked. Taylor shrugged. He has witnesses who claim to have seen him there, hotel receipts. It's possible he hired others to do his dirty work while establishing an alibi for himself. Of course he did, Matthew said grimly. Men like Hargrove never do their own dirty work. I've got deputies watching him, Taylor assured them. If he makes a move, we'll know about it. But Hargrove made no move, at least none that they could detect. The remaining days of Catherine's agreed-upon absence passed without incident, leading Grant to hope that perhaps the judge's ruling and the increased scrutiny from the sheriff had convinced Hargrove to back down. Matthew wasn't convinced. It's too quiet, he told Grant the night before Catherine was due to return. Hargrove's not the type to give up so easily. Grant nodded slowly. I know, but what more can we do? We can't prove he was behind the fire, and Catherine won't stay in Denver indefinitely based on suspicion alone. I'll ride to Fort Collins tomorrow to meet her stage, Matthew decided. Just to be safe. The following morning dawned clear and cool, a perfect late summer day in the Colorado Territory. Matthew set out early for the half-day ride to Fort Collins, planning to arrive well before Catherine's stage was scheduled. He was halfway there when he spotted a rider approaching at a gallop from the direction of town. As the figure drew closer, Matthew recognized one of the Double G hands who had been sent to town for supplies the previous day. Mr. McCall, the young cowboy called out as he reined in his lathered horse. Thank God I found you. What's happened? Matthew demanded, immediately alert to the urgency in the hand's voice. It's Miss Catherine's stage, the cowboy gasped, trying to catch his breath. Word just reached town. It was attacked yesterday afternoon, about 20 miles outside of Denver. Matthew felt as if the ground had dropped away beneath him. Catherine, he managed to ask, his throat suddenly dry with fear. Taken, the cowboy reported grimly. The driver and guard were shot. A passenger who survived said 4 masked men stopped the coach and took Miss Catherine. Left everyone else behind. For a moment Matthew couldn't speak, couldn't think, then a cold, focused clarity descended upon him. Hargrove, he said, the name like a curse on his lips. Sheriff thinks so too, the cowboy confirmed. But Hargrove was seen in Silver Creek at the time of the attack. He couldn't have done it himself. He didn't need to, Matthew replied, already turning his horse. Ride back to the Double G. Tell Grant what's happened and that I've gone to Silver Creek. Shouldn't we gather men, form a posse? The cowboy asked, confused. Matthew shook his head. No time, and a large group would be noticed. Tell Grant I'll bring her back. Without waiting for a response, Matthew spurred his horse toward Silver Creek. The 20-mile ride passed in a blur of dust and determination, his mind filled with images of Catherine in danger, Catherine frightened, Catherine in Hargrove's power. Each thought drove him faster, harder, until his horse was lathered with exertion. Silver Creek appeared on the horizon as the sun reached its zenith. Matthew approached cautiously, skirting the main settlement to approach Hargrove's warehouse from the rear. He left his exhausted horse concealed in a stand of trees and continued on foot, his rifle in hand and his revolver ready at his hip. The warehouse appeared quiet, with only a few men moving about the yard loading supplies onto wagons. Matthew watched patiently, waiting for some sign that would tell him where Catherine might be held. His patience was rewarded when Victor Hargrove himself emerged from the main office building, accompanied by the man Matthew recognized as Jensen from the night of the rustling attempt. They spoke briefly, then Jensen mounted a horse and rode toward the hills north of town where Hargrove's mining operations were located. Matthew's instincts told him to follow. If Catherine was being held anywhere, it would be away from town where curious eyes might see something they shouldn't. Moving carefully to avoid detection, Matthew made his way back to his horse and set off after Jensen, maintaining enough distance to avoid being spotted while keeping the rider in sight. The trail led into increasingly rugged terrain, eventually reaching a small mining camp nestled in a narrow valley. Unlike Hargrove's main operations, this camp appeared to be only minimally staffed, with just a handful of men visible around the cluster of crude buildings. Jensen rode directly to a small cabin set apart from the others, dismounted, and entered without knocking. Matthew left his horse hidden behind a rocky outcropping and approached on foot, using the scattered boulders and scrub brush for cover. When he reached the edge of the camp, he settled in to observe, studying the movements of the men and the layout of the buildings. There were 4 men besides Jensen, all armed, moving about the camp with the casual confidence of those who believed themselves far from prying eyes. Matthew's attention, however, remained fixed on the cabin where Jensen had disappeared. If Catherine was here, that's where she would be held. His suspicion was confirmed when the cabin door opened and Jensen emerged with another man. Their words carried clearly in the still mountain air. "Hargrove says to keep her here until he arrives tonight," Jensen was saying. "No one talks to her except him." "She's a feisty one," the other man commented with a chuckle that made Matthew's blood boil. "Tried to brain me with a water pitcher when I brought her food." That sounds like Catherine, Matthew thought with grim pride. Even in captivity, she remained defiant. Jensen mounted his horse. "I'm heading back to town. Hargrove wants everything ready for his meeting with Grant tomorrow." "What meeting?" the other man asked. Jensen smirked. "The one where Grant signs over his ranch in exchange for his precious daughter. Hargrove's got the papers all drawn up." As Jensen rode away, Matthew considered his options. 5 men remained in the camp, all armed and likely experienced in violence. A frontal assault would be suicide, and even if he succeeded in reaching Catherine, they would be pursued immediately. Patience, he told himself. Wait for darkness. Wait for the right moment. The hours crawled by as the sun began its descent behind the western mountains. Matthew used the time to study the men's patterns, when they ate, when they changed guards at the cabin, where each man positioned himself during quiet periods. As dusk settled over the valley, the miners gathered around a fire outside the main bunkhouse, passing a bottle between them. Only one man remained on guard outside Catherine's cabin, occasionally pacing back and forth to stay alert. Matthew circled the camp, approaching the cabin from the rear where the guard's view was obstructed. The small building was crudely constructed, with visible gaps between the wall boards through which lamplight flickered. Matthew found a wider gap and peered inside. Catherine sat on a narrow cot, her hands bound before her but her feet free. Her hair had come loose from its pins, falling around her shoulders in golden disarray. There was a bruise on her cheek that made Matthew's jaw clench with fury, but otherwise she appeared unharmed. Most importantly, her expression wasn't one of fear or defeat but of contained anger as she worked systematically at the ropes binding her wrists. Matthew's heart swelled with pride and determination. She hadn't given up. She was fighting in her own way, just as he would fight for her. He moved to the corner of the cabin, where the guard's pacing would bring him momentarily out of sight of the men by the fire. When the guard rounded the corner, Matthew was waiting. One powerful blow to the jaw, and the man crumpled unconsciously to the ground. Matthew quickly dragged him behind the cabin, bound him with his own bandana, and took his keys. The cabin door unlocked with a soft click. Catherine's head snapped up, her body tensing for resistance. When she recognized Matthew, her expression transformed from defiance to astonishment, then to such profound relief that it nearly undid him. "Matthew," she whispered, rising from the cot. He crossed to her in 2 strides, using his knife to cut through her bonds. "Are you hurt?" he asked urgently, his eyes taking in the bruise on her face. "No," she assured him, "just angry. They ambushed the stage, shot poor Mr. Jenkins and the guard." Her voice caught. "Hargrove plans to force father to sign over the ranch." "I know," Matthew said grimly, "but that's not going to happen. Can you ride?" Catherine's response was to move immediately toward the door. "Let's go." "Wait," Matthew cautioned, pulling her gently back. "There are 4 more men out there. We need to be careful." He outlined his plan quickly: slip away through the darkness to where he had left his horse, then make their way down the mountain using routes only someone familiar with the terrain would know. Catherine listened intently, then nodded her understanding. "I'm ready." They slipped out of the cabin into the gathering darkness, keeping to the shadows as they edged away from the circle of firelight where the miners continued their drinking. They had nearly reached the perimeter of the camp when a shout went up behind them. "The woman's gone, and Peterson's down." "Run," Matthew urged, pulling Catherine toward the rocks where his horse waited. Behind them, men scrambled for weapons as lanterns were raised to pierce the darkness. They reached the horse just as the first shots rang out, bullets whining off nearby rocks. Matthew boosted Catherine into the saddle, then swung up behind her. The horse, sensing the urgency, leapt forward at Matthew's command, carrying them away from the camp into the darkness of the mountain forest. Their pursuers were not far behind, the sounds of hoofbeats and shouted commands echoing through the night. Matthew guided the horse along game trails too narrow for side-by-side pursuit, forcing their hunters to follow in single file and limiting their ability to flank the escaping pair. "They'll expect us to head for the ranch or town," Matthew said, his mouth close to Catherine's ear as they rode. "We'll go east instead into the high country. I know places up there where they won't find us." Catherine nodded, her body pressed against his as they navigated the treacherous mountain trails in near darkness. Despite the danger, despite the men hunting them through the night, Matthew felt a fierce joy in having her safe in his arms. Whatever came next, he had found her. She was alive and unharmed, her spirit unbroken. They rode through the night, stopping only when necessary to rest their exhausted horse. By dawn, the sounds of pursuit had faded, though Matthew remained vigilant, choosing their route carefully to avoid leaving obvious tracks. As the sun rose fully, they reached a small, hidden valley high in the mountains, where a clear stream provided water and sparse grass for their horse. Sheltered by towering pines and a natural rock formation, it offered a temporary haven while they decided their next move. "We should be safe here for a few hours," Matthew said as he helped Catherine dismount. Her legs buckled slightly from exhaustion and he caught her, holding her steady until she found her balance. "Thank you," she said softly, looking up at him with eyes that reflected both weariness and wonder, "for finding me. For coming after me." Matthew's hands remained at her waist, unable to let go just yet. "Did you think I wouldn't?" "I knew you would," she replied simply. "Even when Hargrove was gloating about his perfect plan, telling me how he would finally have everything he wanted, I knew you would come." The absolute certainty in her voice humbled him. All his life, Matthew had believed that relying on others was a weakness, that true strength came from standing alone. Yet here was Catherine, stronger than anyone he had ever known, openly acknowledging her faith in him without seeing it as diminishment. "I will always come for you," he promised, the words emerging with the weight of an oath. "Wherever you are, whatever stands between us, I will find you." Catherine reached up to touch his face, her fingers gentle against the stubble that had grown during his desperate search. "I know," she said again, and then she kissed him. Unlike their previous kisses, tentative explorations of newfound feelings, this one held the fierce certainty of people who had faced death and separation, and emerged with absolute clarity about what mattered most. Matthew pulled her closer, pouring into the kiss all the fear and determination that had driven him through the night, all the relief at finding her alive, all the love that had grown within him despite his every attempt to guard against it. When they finally parted, both breathing heavily, Matthew rested his forehead against hers. "We need to get word to your father," he said reluctantly. "Hargrove expects him to come to Silver Creek tomorrow for this supposed meeting." "It's a trap," Catherine said immediately. "Hargrove has no intention of letting either of us go, no matter what father agrees to. He told me as much." Matthew nodded grimly. "I suspected as much. He can't afford to leave witnesses to kidnapping and extortion." He considered their options. "We're closer to Fort Collins from here than to the ranch. If we can make it there by nightfall, we can alert Sheriff Taylor and have a posse ready when Hargrove arrives for the meeting." They rested for several hours, allowing their horse to recover while they took turns keeping watch. No sign of pursuit appeared, suggesting their hunters had either lost their trail or returned to the mining camp to report their failure to Hargrove. By mid-afternoon, they were on the move again, descending from the high country toward the plains where Fort Collins lay. As they rode, Catherine recounted the details of her abduction, how the stage had been stopped by masked men who had shot the driver and guard without warning, how she had fought until threatened with the same fate, how Hargrove had appeared the previous evening to gloat over his imminent victory. "He's desperate," she concluded. "The judge's ruling threatened everything he's been working toward. I think he's decided that if legal means won't get him what he wants, he has nothing to lose by resorting to outright criminality." Matthew agreed. Men like Hargrove can't accept defeat, and he wants the Double G as much for spite as for profit now. They reached Fort Collins as dusk was falling, riding directly to the sheriff's office. Sheriff Taylor's reaction to Catherine's appearance was one of shocked relief followed by grim determination as they related the events of the past 2 days. "Kidnapping's a hanging offense," Taylor said when they finished. "Even a man with Hargrove's connections can't escape that, not with both of you as witnesses." A deputy was dispatched immediately to the Double G to inform George Grant of his daughter's safety, and to prevent him from walking into Hargrove's trap the following day. Meanwhile, Taylor assembled a posse to ride to Silver Creek at first light. "You both need rest," the sheriff told Matthew and Catherine. My wife will see to a room for Miss Grant at the hotel. McCall, you can bunk here at the jail if you like. Catherine shook her head firmly. I'm not leaving Matthew's side until this is finished, she declared. We'll both stay at the hotel. The sheriff raised his eyebrows but didn't argue. As you wish, Miss Grant. I'll arrange for separate rooms and a guard at your door. Later, as they stood in the hotel corridor outside their adjacent rooms, Matthew found himself reluctant to part from Catherine, even for the few hours of sleep they both desperately needed. I'll be right next door, he assured her. And the sheriff's man will be in the hallway all night. Catherine smiled tiredly. I know, she hesitated, then continued with characteristic directness. I feel safe with you, Matthew. Safer than I've ever felt with anyone. The simple declaration touched something deep within him. All his life, Matthew had defined safety as the absence of threat, the elimination of risk. But Catherine's words suggested a different understanding, safety not as isolation but as connection, as the knowledge that whatever dangers came, they would face them together. Get some rest, he said softly. Tomorrow we end this. The posse rode out of Fort Collins at dawn, 15 men strong including Matthew, Sheriff Taylor, and 3 deputies. Catherine had insisted on accompanying them despite Matthew's objections, arguing that as the victim of the kidnapping, her testimony would be crucial in ensuring Hargrove's arrest and conviction. Besides, she added with a sidelong glance at Matthew, I've seen how well staying behind for my own protection worked out last time. They reached Silver Creek by mid-morning. The small settlement appeared quiet, unaware of the drama about to unfold. Sheriff Taylor divided his men, positioning some around Hargrove's warehouse while he led the main group, including Matthew and Catherine, directly to Hargrove's office. Victor Hargrove was seated behind his desk when they entered, his expression changing from surprise to calculation to carefully composed confidence in the space of seconds. Sheriff Taylor, he greeted smoothly, this is unexpected. And Miss Grant, I had heard distressing news of your abduction. I'm relieved to see you safe. Save it, Hargrove, Taylor cut in. We know everything. The stage robbery, the kidnapping, your plan to extort the Double G from George Grant. Your men at the mining camp have already been arrested. For a moment, Hargrove's mask of civility slipped, revealing the cold fury beneath. Then he smiled, leaning back in his chair with calculated ease. Serious accusations, Sheriff, but where is your evidence? Miss Grant is clearly unharmed, and I've been right here in Silver Creek, as numerous witnesses can attest. We have Mr. McCall's testimony of overhearing your orders to the rustlers, Taylor replied. We have Miss Grant's account of her abduction and your visit to her place of captivity, and by now, my deputies will have found evidence at your mining camp connecting you directly to the crime. Hargrove's confidence wavered visibly. He glanced toward the office door as if calculating his chances of escape. Matthew tensed, ready to intercept him if he tried to flee. You're finished, Hargrove, Catherine said quietly. The railroad will withdraw its claim when they learn of your methods, and you'll spend the rest of your life in prison, if you're not hanged for the murder of the stage driver and guard. Something dangerous flashed in Hargrove's eyes. You think you've won, he spat, all pretense of civility abandoned. You and your cowboy and your self-righteous father, none of you understand what it takes to build something in this godforsaken territory. I've worked too hard, come too far to be stopped now. His hand moved suddenly toward his desk drawer. Matthew reacted instantly, drawing his revolver and stepping in front of Catherine. Don't, he warned. Hargrove froze, then slowly raised his hands. You're making a mistake, McCall. I have friends in Denver, connections with the territorial government. This isn't over. Yes, Matthew replied steadily. It is. Sheriff Taylor moved forward to place Hargrove under arrest, reading out the charges as he secured the man's wrists with handcuffs. As the sheriff led their prisoner from the office, Catherine turned to Matthew, her expression a mixture of relief and lingering tension. Is it really over? She asked. Matthew holstered his weapon, then took her hands in his. The danger is, yes, Hargrove will face justice for what he's done and the Double G is safe. He hesitated, then added, but for us, I hope this is just the beginning. The journey back to the Double G was considerably less hurried than their flight from the mining camp had been. They arrived to find George Grant pacing anxiously on the porch, his face lighting with joy at the sight of Catherine riding safely beside Matthew. Catherine, he cried, rushing to help her dismount and pulling her into a fierce embrace. When the deputy came with news of your rescue, I nearly wept with relief. I'm all right, Father, she assured him, returning his embrace. thanks to Matthew. Grant turned to Matthew, extending his hand. I can never repay what you've done, he said, his voice thick with emotion. Matthew shook his hand firmly. No payment necessary, sir. I did what any man would do for. He paused, suddenly aware of the inadequacy of any conventional phrase to describe what Catherine had become to him. For the woman he loves, Grant finished for him, his expression knowing. Yes, I believe you did. In the days that followed, life at the Double G gradually returned to its normal rhythms. The burned pasture would take time to recover, but the autumn rains had begun, promising new growth in the spring. Hargrove remained in custody, with a trial date set for the following month. The railroad, eager to distance itself from the scandal, officially withdrew its claim on Double G land. Matthew continued his duties as foreman, though with a new sense of purpose. The ranch was no longer simply his place of employment, but the home he had never allowed himself to hope for. And Catherine was the future he had never dared to imagine. On a clear evening a week after their return, Matthew found Catherine in her usual spot on the porch, watching the sunset paint the western sky in shades of gold and crimson. She smiled as he approached, making room for him on the bench beside her. I had a letter from Aunt Sophia today, she said as he sat. She's quite disappointed that my visit to Denver was cut short by such dreadful business and insists I come stay with her again under more pleasant circumstances. Matthew smiled. Will you go? Perhaps, Catherine replied, her eyes twinkling, but not alone. Aunt Sophia also mentioned that she would be delighted to meet the heroic young man she's heard so much about. I'm no hero, Matthew protested, as he had so many times before. Catherine turned to face him fully. You are to me, she said simply. Not because you rescued me, though I'm certainly grateful for that, but because you've shown me what real courage looks like. The courage to open yourself to possibilities you never thought you deserved. Her insight, as always, cut straight to the heart of the matter. Matthew had spent years believing that survival meant isolation, that caring deeply for another person was a weakness he couldn't afford in the harsh reality of the frontier. Catherine had proven him wrong, not through argument but through her own example of strength through connection. I have something for you, he said, reaching into his pocket and withdrawing a small object. He held it in his closed fist for a moment, suddenly nervous despite all they had been through together. It's not much, not what you deserve, but... He opened his hand to reveal a simple gold band, unadorned but carefully polished. It was my mother's, he explained. The only thing of hers I kept after the fever took her. My father gave it to her when they decided to make a life together in Kansas territory, with nothing to their names but hope and determination. Catherine's eyes widened as she understood what he was offering. Matthew, I still don't have much to offer, he continued, the words coming more easily now. No land of my own, no fortune, no guarantees in this unpredictable country. But I can promise you this, Catherine Grant, I will love you with everything I am for as long as I live. I will build a life with you wherever that life takes us. I will never take for granted the gift of your heart. He took her hand, the ring poised at the tip of her finger. If you'll have me, that is. Catherine's eyes shone with unshed tears as she smiled at him. Matthew McCall, she said, her voice steady despite the emotion evident in her face, I have never been more certain of anything in my life. She extended her finger, allowing him to slide the ring into place. It fit perfectly, as if it had been made for her all along. My father will expect a proper conversation, she added with a hint of mischief, though I suspect he's been anticipating this moment since the day you rode into the yard as our new foreman. I spoke with him this morning, Matthew admitted. Asked for his blessing. Catherine's eyebrows rose in surprise, and he said he'd been waiting for me to get around to it, and that he couldn't imagine a better man for his daughter or a better partner for the future of the Double G. The future of the Double G, Catherine repeated, curious. Matthew nodded. Your father offered me a partnership in the ranch, said he's not getting any younger and wants to ensure the Double G passes to someone who loves the land as much as he does. He paused, suddenly uncertain. I haven't given him my answer yet. I wanted to speak with you first. If you'd prefer to make our own way, start fresh somewhere. Catherine silenced him with a kiss. When she pulled back, her expression was one of absolute certainty. The Double G is my home, Matthew, our home, if you want it to be. He did want it with a fierce intensity that surprised him. This land that had seemed merely a temporary stopping place on his journey had become, without his realizing it, the home he had been searching for all along. not because of the property itself, but because of the woman who had made it a place of belonging rather than merely survival. "I do," he said simply. They were married in the early spring, when the burned pasture was beginning to show the first signs of new growth. The ceremony took place on the porch of the Double G, with Judge Hollister officiating and neighbors from miles around in attendance. Catherine wore a dress of pale blue that matched her eyes, with wildflowers in her golden hair. Matthew, at Catherine's insistence, wore a new suit ordered specially from Denver. As they spoke their vows beneath the vast Colorado sky, Matthew reflected on the journey that had brought him to this moment. From a solitary drifter, convinced that the frontier allowed no room for love, to a man surrounded by community, bound by choice and devotion to the extraordinary woman before him. Life in the West would never be easy. There would always be droughts and blizzards, rustlers and land disputes, the thousand natural challenges of wresting a living from a beautiful but unforgiving land. But Matthew no longer faced these challenges alone, nor did he want to. In Catherine he had found not weakness but strength, not vulnerability but resilience. And as they sealed their vows with a kiss, the cheers of their friends and neighbors rising around them, Matthew McCall, once so certain that fate was nothing but a comforting lie, found himself grateful beyond words for whatever force, chance, or destiny had placed him outside that general store on the exact day when Catherine Grant's runaway wagon had come barreling down the street and into his carefully ordered life. Some might call it coincidence, others might call it fate. Matthew, holding his bride in his arms under the endless western sky, simply called it home.